In the quiet farmlands of Ohio, the year 1856 was remembered not for its harvest or the changing seasons, but for an event so strange that whispers of it spread far beyond the fields and fences of the small community where it unfolded. A modest family, simple and unassuming, suddenly found themselves thrust into the center of suspicion, fear, and speculation when the wife gave birth to triplets that defied all understanding. In an era when medical knowledge was limited, and superstition still held sway over much of rural life, the arrival of these children was not seen as a blessing but as a riddle, a disruption of natural order that seemed to mock both science and faith. The birth itself was extraordinary, not only because multiple births were rare and dangerous at the time, but because of the odd circumstances reported by the midwives who attended. They claimed the children were eerily identical in their features, so much so that it became nearly impossible to tell them apart. But beyond mere resemblance, there was something about them that unsettled those present. The midwives whispered of the way the infants seemed to lock eyes with each other almost immediately, as though communicating silently in a manner no one could explain. Some said the room felt colder, that the cries of the newborns sounded more like echoes than voices, three sounds overlapping in perfect harmony that chilled the spine. At first, the parents tried to dismiss these fears. They saw their children as blessings, as miracles, but their neighbors were not so easily convinced. Within days of the birth, rumors began to stir. In hushed tones around church pews and market stalls, people wondered if such a thing could be natural. Were the triplets a sign of something divine, or a mark of something unholy? In a world where witchcraft and curses still lingered in the minds of God-fearing people, suspicions were quick to grow. Mothers pulled their children closer when the family passed through town, and men lowered their voices when they spoke of the strange infants. As the triplets grew, the sense of unease only deepened. Unlike other children, they appeared inseparable, moving almost in unison as if bound by an invisible thread. Villagers swore they often found the three sitting together in silence, staring not at one another but in the same direction, their eyes fixed on something unseen. They developed a private language, babbling to each other in patterns that even their parents could not decipher. When one fell ill, the others weakened almost instantly, and when one laughed, the sound was echoed by the other two without delay. It was this unnatural synchronicity that led some to call them the Cursed Three. Doctors from nearby towns were called in, eager to examine the children. In an age when science was still struggling to define itself against the pull of superstition, the triplets became curiosities, specimens rather than children. Learned men poked and prodded, took notes, and left shaking their heads in bewilderment. They could not explain the connection the siblings seemed to share, nor the peculiar atmosphere that surrounded them. Some suggested the phenomenon was medical, a strange quirk of shared development in the womb. Others leaned toward more unsettling explanations, speaking in low voices of deformities of the soul or a birth touched by forces beyond comprehension. As news spread, the family found themselves increasingly isolated. Where once neighbors had been kind, they now crossed the street to avoid the mother and father. Churchgoers whispered that the children had been marked by the devil, while others swore they were harbingers of bad luck. Livestock dying without cause, sudden illnesses, and unexpected accidents were all blamed on the presence of the triplets. The family's farmhouse became a place of both fascination and dread, with strangers passing by only to steal glances, curious but unwilling to step too close. The parents, caught between their love for their children and the crushing weight of suspicion, struggled to keep their family intact. They defended the triplets fiercely, but fear has a way of creeping into even the strongest hearts. Each strange occurrence seemed to build a case against them in the eyes of the community. Each unexplained death, each accident, each whispered rumor added fuel to the fire. By the time the triplets were old enough to walk, the family was living in near complete isolation, with only their bond to one another for comfort. What began as a private mystery soon turned into a legend, one that would echo through Ohio's history long after the family's fate was sealed. The story of the triplets blurred the lines between science and superstition, fact and folklore, leaving behind a trail of questions no one could answer. To some, they were evidence of nature's strange possibilities. To others, proof that there were forces in the world that even science could never tame. In the end, what remained was not clarity but a lingering unease, a sense that the birth of those 3 children had torn a small hole in the fabric of normal life and revealed something too vast, too strange, for the world of 1856 to contain. And so the whispers endured, growing into tales passed from one generation to the next, each retelling making the mystery of the triplets darker and more haunting than before. In the year 1856, Ohio was a land caught between progress and tradition. Railroads were beginning to thread their way through the state, towns were growing, and whispers of industrial expansion promised a new age. Yet, for many who lived in the countryside, life remained rooted in old customs, old fears, and an unshakable dependence on faith. It was in this uneasy balance of modernity and superstition that a story unfolded, one that would later be told and retold in hushed voices. The birth of the Sullivan triplets, children whose arrival seemed to defy both medicine and the natural order. The Sullivan family was ordinary by every measure. Jacob Sullivan, a hard-working farmer, tilled his land with the discipline of a man bound by survival. His wife, Margaret, was known for her quiet kindness and her strong constitution. They were not wealthy, but neither were they destitute. They attended church regularly, contributed to their community, and were viewed as respectable. But all of this changed in the late autumn of 1856, when Margaret went into labor in their modest farmhouse. Childbirth was no stranger to the community, but it was always a dangerous affair. Midwives were summoned, prayers were whispered, and neighbors waited anxiously, ready to assist should the worst happen. But this time, the event quickly transformed from a common rural ordeal into something extraordinary. When Margaret cried out in pain, the first child arrived after a long and grueling effort. The midwife, experienced in her craft, wrapped the child carefully and handed the baby to the exhausted mother. Relief filled the room, until Margaret's cries began again. Another child was coming. This in itself was rare and risky. Twins often spelled tragedy in those days. But the midwives braced themselves, offering words of encouragement as the second infant entered the world. For a brief moment, there was awe. Twins were unusual, but not unheard of. Then, to the shock of everyone present, Margaret's body convulsed once more. A third child, impossibly, was making its way into the world. Gasps echoed in the small farmhouse, and fear flickered across the faces of those present. 3 children born in a single birth was not just rare. It was, to many, unnatural. The midwives worked tirelessly, their hands trembling as the final infant was delivered. The air inside the room seemed heavy, as if charged with an unseen force. Margaret, pale and barely conscious, held her breath as the cries of not 1, not 2, but 3 newborns filled the room. Their voices overlapped in perfect rhythm, creating a haunting sound that lingered long after silence should have returned. Some swore it did not sound like the cries of infants at all, but like echoes bouncing from unseen walls. It was not merely the number of the children that unsettled those present, but their strange similarities. Each of the triplets bore the exact same features, down to the smallest detail: the curve of the lips, the shape of the eyes, the faint birthmark near the temple. Even their tiny hands seemed to move in uncanny unison, fingers curling at the same time as if orchestrated by some invisible command. The midwives exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen twins before, but never had they witnessed such flawless duplication across 3 lives. As the hours passed, the sense of unease deepened. The infants did not cry separately. They wailed together, stopped together, and often fell into an eerie silence, their gazes fixed not on their mother or father, but on each other. One midwife later whispered that it felt as though the children were not 3 separate beings, but one mind divided across 3 bodies. She swore the temperature in the room dropped when their eyes locked, as though an unseen shadow had brushed against her soul. The neighbors who gathered outside the farmhouse began to murmur when word spread. By the time Jacob stepped outside to announce the birth, news of the triplets had already begun to stir fear. In rural Ohio, where superstition mingled with faith, such an event was bound to inspire suspicion. Some whispered that the children were a blessing, a sign of God's favor. Others, more wary, muttered about curses, omens, and unnatural forces. The thought of 3 identical children born at once was simply too much for some to accept. Back inside, Margaret cradled her infants, too exhausted to comprehend the storm her children's existence had unleashed. Jacob, on the other hand, felt a gnawing unease. Though he loved his children instantly, he could not shake the memory of the midwives' trembling hands, nor the way the newborns seemed to move as one. He told himself it was coincidence. But the sight of their eyes glowing faintly in the lamplight, staring at nothing and everything at once, haunted him. The days that followed only deepened the mystery. The infants refused to be separated. When one was taken into another room, the others became restless until they were reunited. Their feeding patterns were identical, their sleep aligned to the second. More disturbingly, they seemed to sense each other's discomfort. When one cried out in hunger, the others began wailing instantly, even if they had been asleep moments before. When one laughed, an eerie, premature chuckle, the other two responded in kind, creating a chorus that unsettled even their mother. The family soon discovered that visitors were reluctant to come near. Some who stepped inside the farmhouse claimed to feel chills run down their spines when they saw the three infants staring at them in perfect silence. Others muttered that they saw the shadows of the babies move differently than their bodies, a trick of the lamplight perhaps, but one that spread rumors faster than truth could catch up. Within weeks, the Sullivan household had transformed from a respected family home into a place people avoided. Doctors from nearby towns were eventually called, intrigued by the strange reports. They examined the infants carefully, noting their uncanny similarities and synchronized behavior. Their conclusions were clinical but unsatisfying. Perhaps the children's similarities were due to rare but natural causes. Yet even the men of science could not deny the unsettling atmosphere that clung to the family. Their notes reflected not only biology, but unease. Words like peculiar, unnatural, inexplicable appeared often in their records. By the end of that first winter, the Sullivans were already feeling the weight of their children's mystery. Margaret, though fiercely protective, admitted in private that sometimes she feared her own offspring. She could not explain the sensation of being watched even when the triplets slept, nor the way their cries sometimes seemed to echo long after silence fell. Jacob, struggling between love and fear, kept his doubts hidden. But in the quiet hours of the night, he wondered if his children were entirely human. Thus, from the very beginning, the Sullivan triplets were not merely seen as children, but as enigmas, symbols of something beyond the comprehension of their time. Their birth, once a moment of hope and joy, had already begun to cast a long shadow over their family and community. It was a shadow that would only grow darker as the years passed, and as the triplets' mystery deepened in ways no one could have imagined. The first year of the Sullivan triplets' lives passed with a strange, almost unbearable tension that hovered over the household like a storm cloud refusing to break. In most families, the first steps and first words of children are celebrated milestones, but in the Sullivan home these moments came wrapped in unease, observed with equal parts awe and fear. What should have been moments of parental pride felt instead like signs of something unearthly unfolding in their midst. It began subtly. When the children were barely old enough to sit upright, Margaret noticed how they seemed to turn their heads together, their eyes tracking invisible shapes that no one else could see. At times, the three would fix their gaze upon a corner of the room, staring intently as though transfixed by some presence. The farmhouse grew eerily quiet during those moments, and visitors often claimed to feel an unseen chill sweep through the air. Margaret told herself it was only childish imagination, but in her heart she wondered whether her children saw things that others could not. Their development defied explanation. Most infants struggled with balance. Yet the triplets appeared to move in uncanny harmony. They pulled themselves upright almost at the same age, their tiny hands grasping the wooden furniture as though they had rehearsed the movement beforehand. They crawled in synchronized rhythm, their small bodies scuttling across the floor like reflections of one another. And when they began to laugh, it was never solitary. One chuckle instantly ignited the same sound from the other two, forming a chorus of mirth that felt unnervingly rehearsed. By the time they reached 2 years of age, the whispers in the community had grown louder. Neighbors spoke of the all-natural children, who never cried separately, never seemed to act independently. When Jacob and Margaret brought them to church, the congregation shifted uncomfortably in the pews as the triplets sat silent and still, their wide eyes staring toward the pulpit without blinking. The preacher's words seemed to falter beneath their gaze. Some claimed that the children made the oil lamps flicker, though whether it was imagination or truth, no one could say. The Sullivans did their best to shield the children from the growing rumors, but fear seeped into even the strongest walls. The midwives who had delivered them rarely visited, muttering about unnatural bonds. Mothers discouraged their own children from playing near the Sullivan farmhouse. The isolation that followed only tightened the strange bond of the three siblings, who appeared to need no company but each other's. They invented their own sounds, an odd, lilting language that no one else understood. Margaret tried desperately to teach them words like mama and papa, but though they could mimic the sounds, their private tongue dominated their conversations. They seemed to laugh at their parents when they spoke, as if sharing some inside joke no one else could grasp. It was during the summer of 1858 that the first truly alarming incident occurred. The Sullivans had taken the children into town, hoping exposure to others might soften the rumors. As the triplets sat together in a small cart, a dog suddenly bolted across the street, startling the townsfolk. To the astonishment of everyone present, the triplets turned their heads in unison, raised their hands, and let out a sound that was neither scream nor laugh. The dog froze in its tracks, whining as though struck by an unseen force, and bolted in the opposite direction. Silence swept through the street, broken only by the murmur of fearful voices. From that day on, people whispered not just of oddness but of power. Jacob tried to dismiss the event as coincidence, a child's cry startling the animal. Yet in his heart he wrestled with doubts. At night he lay awake beside Margaret, staring into the rafters, haunted by the image of his children's faces lit by the lamplight, their eyes glowing faintly as though they held secrets too vast for mortal comprehension. Margaret, though fiercely protective, confessed in quiet whispers that she sometimes feared them, not for their safety, but for what they might do or become. The triplets grew stronger as the years pressed on, but their presence weighed heavier on the community. When they entered a room, conversations faltered. Some swore they heard whispers in their heads when the children looked at them for too long. Others claimed the triplets' shadows didn't always move in unison with their bodies, though such talk was always shared in hushed tones, for fear of being mocked or, worse, cursed. A physician from Columbus, intrigued by the rumors, traveled to examine them in 1859. He recorded meticulous notes, remarking on their identical physiology and extraordinary synchronicity. Yet he also confessed, in private letters, that he felt as though I were in the presence of something unnatural, some great experiment of God or devil. He could find no scientific explanation for their behaviors, their shared language, their mirrored movements, their chilling way of stopping and staring without blinking for minutes at a time. One of the most unsettling patterns involved their dreams. At night, the farmhouse echoed with their voices, speaking in the same strange tongue they had invented. Sometimes, Margaret swore she heard them laughing in perfect unison, as though recounting the same dream to each other. Once, she found them sitting upright in their beds, eyes wide open, whispering to one another though fully asleep. When she touched their shoulders, they turned to her with identical expressions, cold, distant, and unrecognizable from her beloved children. It was in that moment that she fled the room, crossing herself and whispering a prayer too afraid to wake them. Despite the fear, there were moments of undeniable love. Jacob and Margaret adored their children and clung to the hope that time would make them seem more ordinary. They dressed them differently, tried to teach them separate tasks, even encouraged them to play a part. But every attempt failed. The triplets gravitated back to one another with a magnetic pull that could not be broken. They ate together, played together, even fell sick together, recovering at the same pace. It was as though their very lives were braided into one thread, inseparable and indivisible. By their 4th year, the triplets had become a story whispered across Ohio. Travelers repeated tales of the mystic children of the Sullivan farm. Some called them miracles, evidence of divine intervention. Others spoke of curses, dark magic, and unnatural experiments. Whatever the interpretation, one fact remained unshakable. No one who saw them left unchanged. The Sullivans, once a respected family, now lived under a cloud of suspicion. Though Jacob worked his fields and Margaret tended her home, they were no longer greeted warmly by neighbors. Instead, doors closed quickly when they approached, and whispers followed them through town. Yet, for all the fear and superstition, none could deny the fascination. People could not help but glance over their shoulders at the farmhouse at the edge of the fields, wondering what went on within its walls when night fell. And within those walls, 3 children sat together, speaking in a language no one else knew, smiling with a knowledge too deep for their age. It was as though they were waiting for something that only they understood, something that the rest of the world would one day have no choice but to face. By the year 1862, the Sullivan triplets were no longer toddlers but children old enough to run through fields, speak in complete sentences, and leave a deeper mark upon those around them. Yet what unsettled their neighbors most was not simply their growth, but the fact that with every passing year, the children seemed less like individuals and more like three reflections of a single, strange entity. Where most children grew into their own quirks and personalities, the Sullivan triplets became even more inseparably bound, their lives unfolding as though written by one hand. At 6 years old, their private language had not disappeared, instead, it had evolved. Witnesses claimed that when the triplets spoke to each other, their strange tongue was fast, sharp, and rhythmic, bearing the cadence of something rehearsed or ancient. They still spoke English when prompted, but it was stilted, as though their true thoughts were always expressed in their hidden dialect. Neighbors who overheard them sometimes swore that the words carried echoes, that the voices of 3 children sounded like many more, reverberating strangely through the farmhouse walls. The oddest incidents occurred when they played outdoors. The triplets would vanish into the woods for hours, only to return together, their clothes clean, their expressions blank, as if no time had passed at all. Jacob once followed them, determined to see what they did, but when he reached the tree line, he lost them almost immediately. He searched for an hour, calling their names until suddenly they emerged from the very path he had just walked, all 3 smiling faintly. When he demanded to know where they had been, they merely exchanged glances, as though sharing a secret no one else was meant to understand. Margaret, who once clung to hope that her children would grow more ordinary, now found herself racked with a quiet dread. She loved them, of course, fiercely and unconditionally. But love did not erase the gnawing fear she felt in the pit of her stomach when she awoke at night and saw their 3 small silhouettes standing silently at her bedside. Watching her sleep, she would startle awake, gasping, and they would tilt their heads in perfect unison before retreating wordlessly to their room. She asked them once why they did it, and the only answer she received was a chillingly calm response. We were waiting. Waiting for what? They would not say. By now, the whispers in town had grown into something darker. Stories of strange accidents near the Sullivan farm circulated like wildfire. A farmhand who mocked the children broke his leg the very next day in a freak accident with his plow. A neighbor's barn caught fire after he loudly declared the triplets were cursed. Though no proof tied these events to the children, suspicion blossomed quickly in a community steeped in superstition. More than one villager suggested that Jacob and Margaret should do something about their brood. Some even hinted that the church should intervene. The local preacher, a stern but cautious man named Reverend Clark, eventually paid a visit to the Sullivan home. He arrived with his Bible in hand, prepared to confront what many whispered might be evil influence. But when he entered the house and sat before the children, his words faltered. The triplets sat side by side in a row, their eyes fixed on him, their expressions unreadable. When he began to recite scripture, their lips moved along with his, perfectly in time, repeating his verses as though they had memorized them beforehand. He grew flustered, skipped to another passage, only for them to continue, their voices low and steady, mirroring his every word. Finally, shaken, he closed the book and left, muttering something about strange gifts, but refusing to return. The family's isolation deepened. Invitations to community gatherings dried up, and Jacob found himself struggling to sell his crops at market. Margaret's friends no longer visited, their excuses thinly veiled. The Sullivan farmhouse, once a place of warmth, now carried the aura of a haunted dwelling, avoided even by those passing on the road. Yet within its walls, life went on, strange, unsettling, but continuous. The triplets seemed unaffected by the rejection, as though they never needed the outside world at all. What unnerved their parents most was the way the children anticipated things. They often seemed to know when Jacob would return from the fields before he appeared. They knew when visitors would knock at the door, sometimes sitting by the entrance minutes beforehand. On one occasion, Margaret dropped a ceramic bowl in the kitchen, only to find all 3 children standing in the doorway moments later. Whispering broke, before she even told them. These incidents, small though they were, built into an overwhelming sense that the triplets existed on a plane of awareness beyond ordinary children. By their 7th year, the dreams began again, this time darker and more intense. The farmhouse echoed at night with their voices chanting in their strange tongue, louder than before. Sometimes Margaret and Jacob would wake to find the children's windows open, the curtains blowing in the night air, though they were certain they had locked them. Once, Jacob swore he saw the 3 standing in the yard beneath the moonlight, holding hands in a circle, their lips moving silently. When he rushed outside, they were back in bed asleep, as though they had never left. Perhaps the most terrifying incident occurred in the autumn of that year. A neighbor's son wandered too close to the Sullivan property while playing. Margaret later found the boy sitting motionless in the field, staring blankly into space, unresponsive. When his father came to retrieve him, the boy finally stirred, but he refused to speak for days. When pressed, he whispered only one phrase, but no one could learn what he meant. The family moved away soon after, unable to shake their unease. Jacob, torn between reason and dread, tried to ground himself in practical matters. He told himself children were mischievous, that neighbors were paranoid, that coincidences had been twisted into supernatural tales. Yet in his private journal, he confessed that even he no longer believed the words he spoke aloud. He wrote of the way their laughter sometimes carried through the halls long after they had gone quiet, how their eyes seemed too old for their faces, how he could not shake the feeling that something ancient looked out from behind their stares. Margaret, meanwhile, clung to her faith. She prayed nightly, asking God for guidance, for protection, for understanding. But even in prayer, she sometimes felt a weight in the room, as though her words were being listened to by someone other than God. Once, she swore she heard the triplets whisper her prayer aloud from the next room, repeating it in perfect time with her words. She dared not ask how they knew. By the end of that year, the Sullivans had resigned themselves to their fate. Their children were not ordinary, and no effort could make them so. The triplets grew taller, stronger, sharper, and with them grew the fear that had now consumed the entire community. Some whispered they were the devil's spawn. Others claimed they were touched by angels. But one truth became increasingly clear: whatever the triplets were, they were not like other children. And as winter descended on Ohio, the farmhouse sat like a beacon of unease, its windows glowing faintly against the snow. Inside, 3 children sat together by the fire, whispering in their strange tongue, their eyes glittering with knowledge that no child of 7 should ever possess. It was as if they were waiting, always waiting, for something yet to come. By the time the Sullivan triplets reached the age of 10, the small Ohio town that once welcomed their family now spoke of them as a shadow hanging over the land. Childhood oddities had transformed into something far more unsettling. They were no longer merely strange children mimicking each other's movements or speaking in secret tongues. They had grown sharper, stronger, and eerily self-aware. It was as though with each passing year, they stepped further away from the realm of ordinary humanity and into something entirely their own. The farmhouse itself seemed to change with them. Once a place of warmth, filled with the laughter of neighbors and the smell of bread rising in the oven, it now stood lonely at the edge of the fields. The shutters creaked in the wind, the walls whispered with drafts, and even the birds avoided nesting near it. Those who passed by claimed the house always seemed colder than the air around it, as though it carried a chill of its own. Yet within its walls, the triplets thrived, speaking in whispers only they understood and moving through their days as though guided by a secret rhythm invisible to all others. It was in their schooling that the first cracks appeared between them and the outside world. Jacob and Margaret, still desperate to provide their children with normal lives, arranged for them to attend the small schoolhouse in town. The experiment lasted less than a month. On the first day, the triplets sat side by side, silent, their eyes fixed on the teacher. When questions were asked, all 3 raised their hands together. When called upon, they gave identical answers, their voices blending until no one could distinguish who had spoken. Other children whispered nervously, some outright refusing to sit near them. By the second week, the teacher admitted she could no longer teach with them present. Their strange energy disrupted the class, unsettling the other pupils. Reluctantly, Jacob withdrew them, their isolation now complete. At home, Their talents began to emerge in ways that were impossible to ignore. They demonstrated knowledge they could not have learned, reciting lines from books Jacob had never read aloud to them, speaking of places they had never visited, even predicting small events before they occurred. Once, Margaret spilled milk on the kitchen table, only to hear the children laugh together and whisper, "Now it falls," just seconds before the pitcher toppled. On another occasion, a storm rattled across the countryside, and the triplets announced the lightning would strike the oak tree by the road. Moments later, a bolt split the tree in two. These incidents might have been dismissed as coincidence if not for their consistency. The children's predictions, their uncanny unity, became impossible to explain. Even Jacob, once the anchor of reason, could no longer deny that something unnatural moved through his offspring. In the quiet of night, he sometimes found himself staring at their sleeping forms, wondering if his children were truly children at all. The townsfolk's fear soon escalated into hostility. Stories spread that crops withered near the Sullivans' land, that livestock grew sick when the triplets passed too close to the barns. A woman swore she saw the children standing at her window in the dead of night, though the farmhouse was miles away. Another man claimed that when he insulted them at market, he later awoke to find his walls covered in black handprints no amount of scrubbing could remove. Whether these tales were exaggerated or entirely imagined, they gained traction quickly in a community where faith and superstition outweighed reason. By the winter of their 12th year, the triplets had become figures of dread. Villagers began avoiding Jacob at market, and some whispered openly that the church should exorcise the family. Reverend Clark, who had once fled their presence, returned reluctantly, driven by growing pressure. But when he entered their home once more, he emerged pale and trembling, refusing to share what he had seen. He only muttered that some mysteries are not meant for men to touch, before he left for good. Margaret, torn between love and fear, withdrew deeper into herself. Her prayers grew longer, her eyes hollow with worry. She confessed to Jacob one night that she no longer recognized her children, that sometimes when she looked at them, she felt as though she were staring into the faces of strangers wearing her son's and daughter's skin. Jacob silenced her, unwilling to speak such thoughts aloud. But in his heart he shared her fear. The triplets, however, seemed unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, about the fear they inspired. They moved through their days with calm detachment, often sitting for hours together in silence, their hands linked, their eyes half closed. When asked what they were doing, they would only say, listening. Listening to what, they would not explain. One evening, in the depths of winter, Jacob awoke to the sound of voices. He followed the murmurs to the children's room, where he found them sitting in a circle on the floor, their faces lit by the pale glow of the moon through the window. Their lips moved quickly, chanting in their secret tongue, their voices weaving together into a sound both mesmerizing and horrifying. Jacob froze, unable to move, as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. He swore the shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally long, bending toward the children as if drawn to their chant. When he finally found the strength to step forward, the voices stopped. The triplets turned their heads to him in perfect unison, their eyes reflecting the moonlight, and whispered softly, "You should not have come." He staggered back, shaken to his core. For the first time, Jacob considered the unthinkable, that perhaps his children were no longer his at all, but something else entirely. By spring, the town's fear had reached a breaking point. Parents forbade their children from venturing near the Sullivan farm. Some called for the family to leave Ohio altogether, fearing the triplets would bring ruin upon them all. Yet no one dared confront Jacob directly. There was a silent understanding among the townsfolk that the Sullivans were untouchable. Not because of protection, but because of fear of what might happen if they acted against them. Within the farmhouse, the triplets continued their strange existence, growing taller, sharper, more uncanny by the day. Their bond seemed unbreakable, their knowledge expanding beyond their years. And through it all, a sense of waiting hung heavy in the air, as though the children anticipated some moment, some revelation, that would explain their very existence. Jacob and Margaret clung desperately to the hope that they might still save their children, that somewhere in the strange web of superstition and fear lay a truth that could be understood. But in the shadows of their home, in the whispers of their children's strange tongue, they sensed a darker reality, that whatever the triplets were, they had never truly belonged to this world at all. The year the Sullivan triplets turned 13 marked the beginning of their full transformation from unsettling children into ominous young figures whose presence dominated the town of Dover, Ohio. The once small peculiarities of childhood had now matured into something sharper, darker, and far more deliberate. It was no longer enough to dismiss their behavior as innocent strangeness. The triplets had become something else entirely, calculating, secretive, and aware of their own power. Their physical appearance only added to the unease. Each of the three grew at the same pace, their features sharpening in an identical rhythm, as though they were carved from the same piece of flesh. To look at one was to see the others, mirror images, but not quite human in their symmetry. The townsfolk muttered that it was unnatural for children to share not only thoughts and gestures, but the very shape of their faces and bodies, as though some invisible hand guided their growth. Jacob and Margaret Sullivan tried desperately to treat them as ordinary adolescents. Margaret baked cakes for their birthdays, stitched them clothes, and prayed over them in the evenings. Jacob attempted to teach them carpentry, hoping the grounding work of tools and wood might tether them to something real. But each attempt at normalcy failed. The children humored their parents for brief moments before retreating into their private world, leaving Jacob and Margaret more isolated than ever in their own home. The triplets rarely quarreled with one another. Instead, they moved with a unity that unsettled anyone who watched them. They spoke less and less to outsiders, and when they did, their voices carried a strange rhythm, as though they were not speaking spontaneously, but reciting lines from a script written only for them. Many villagers described encounters where the triplets answered questions before they were even asked, or completed one another's sentences with such precision that it felt rehearsed. It was during this time that the incidents of inexplicable phenomena became impossible to ignore. Fields near the Sullivan farm grew barren, with corn rotting in its stalks and cattle falling ill without cause. Families began to whisper that the children were bringing a curse upon the land. One spring evening, when a barn belonging to the town's blacksmith caught fire, many swore they had seen the triplets standing in the distance, their faces glowing with the reflection of the flames. Though there was no proof, the rumor spread like wildfire, and with it came the certainty that the Sullivan children were no longer safe to be near. Jacob found himself at odds with his neighbors. Once respected, he was now shunned. When he entered the marketplace, people turned their backs. Some spat in the dirt at his feet. The weight of shame and suspicion bore heavily on him, but still he defended his children fiercely. "They are mine," he would say, his voice trembling. "Whatever they are mine." Yet even as he said the words, a voice inside him questioned whether he believed them. Margaret's faith wavered most of all. Her prayers became frantic, her nights restless. She confessed to Jacob that she often heard whispers when she passed the children's room. Whispers that were not in English, not in any language she recognized. Once she claimed she had seen their eyes shine in the dark like the eyes of an animal. Jacob dismissed these visions as the result of her exhaustion, but deep inside, he too had begun to see things. Shadows that moved where they should not. Flickers of light that danced around the children when they sat in their silent circles. The triplets themselves seemed aware of the fear they inspired, though whether they enjoyed it or simply accepted it as natural was unclear. One evening, when Jacob confronted them about their behavior, asking why they would not play with other children or attend church, the three only smiled. "They do not need us," one of them said, "and we do not need them." The other two nodded in perfect agreement, their gazes steady, unblinking. Jacob felt the words strike him with the weight of finality. It was the first time he realized his children no longer considered themselves part of the world around them. What disturbed Jacob and Margaret most was the sense that the triplets were waiting for something. Often, they would sit outside beneath the moon, staring at the sky for hours, their lips moving in silent whispers. When asked what they were doing, they would reply simply, "Listening." Listening for what? Neither parent dared to ask again. By their 14th year, the townsfolk began speaking openly of driving the Sullivans away. Meetings were held in hushed voices at the church and in barns, men gathering to discuss the danger of letting such children grow unchecked. Yet no one dared act. There was always the lingering fear that any attempt to harm or banish the family might bring down some greater wrath upon them. And so the community waited, watching from a distance, as though hoping the problem might resolve itself. Then came the incident with the Miller family. One afternoon, young Samuel Miller, a boy of 14, mocked the triplets as they walked along the dirt road. He called them devil's spawn, and threw a stone in their direction. Witnesses said the three children stopped together, turned to look at him, and did nothing but stare. Samuel froze, his body stiff as though gripped by an unseen force. His friends tried to pull him away, but he could not move. When the triplets finally turned and continued on their way, Samuel collapsed to the ground, trembling and pale. For weeks afterward, he spoke little, his eyes darting nervously whenever the Sullivan children were near. He never explained what had happened in those frozen moments, and perhaps he did not understand it himself. But the story spread quickly, solidifying the triplets' reputation as something more than human. For Jacob and Margaret, life became unbearable. Neighbors no longer visited. Margaret's friends from church turned their faces away. Supplies were harder to trade for, as few wished to deal with them. Isolation wrapped around the farmhouse like a suffocating fog, and yet inside the triplets seemed untouched by it all. They grew taller, stronger, their movements more graceful than ever. They spoke to each other constantly, though often in whispers no one else could understand. At times, their laughter echoed through the house, a sound so cold and unnatural that it made Margaret cover her ears and weep. One night, during a thunderstorm, Jacob found them standing in the field behind the house, their arms raised to the sky. Lightning split the air above them, and though the rain poured in sheets, the children stood untouched, dry as if the storm itself bent around them. When Jacob tried to pull them back inside, they resisted, their voices rising together in a chant that drowned out even the roar of thunder. Terrified, Jacob staggered back, unable to believe what he had seen. By the time the triplets reached 15, their presence had become unbearable for all who knew them. They were no longer children, no longer even adolescents in the ordinary sense. They were being set apart, linked to one another in a way no one could explain, wielding powers that defied reason, and waiting for some unseen destiny to reveal itself. Their parents, once filled with love and hope, now lived in constant fear, uncertain whether the children they had brought into the world were even their own anymore. The Sullivan triplets had become a mystery that not even science, faith, or reason could unravel, and the darkest chapters of their story were still to come. The year the Sullivan triplets turned 16 brought with it a darkness that could no longer be ignored, even by those who had tried to dismiss the strange events of the past. Childhood oddities had matured into deliberate acts, and the once timid whispers about the children had turned into open accusations. In the town of Dover, Ohio, fear had fermented into something far more dangerous: resolve. The people no longer spoke of the triplets in hushed tones, but in voices edged with anger. Something had to be done, they said. Something had to end. For Jacob and Margaret Sullivan, life within their farmhouse had become unbearable. The children they once prayed over now felt like strangers, beings who had outgrown their family and stepped into a world that belonged only to them. At night, Margaret would wake to hear voices in the hallways, voices that seemed to echo though the children were not there. Shadows twisted unnaturally across the walls, sometimes stretching toward her bed as if reaching for her. Jacob, though stronger in outward appearance, was haunted as well. He took to drinking heavily, his Bible sitting unopened on the kitchen table, its pages gathering dust. Faith no longer seemed to offer protection against what lived under his roof. The triplets themselves seemed to grow in strength and confidence. Their bond was no longer a quirk of nature, but an undeniable force. When they entered a room, silence fell as if the air itself bent to their will. They no longer bothered with disguising their strange unity. When one spoke, the others followed in perfect rhythm. When one laughed, the others joined with chilling precision. By 16, their identical features had become striking, beautiful even, but in a way that felt unnatural, too symmetrical, too flawless. To look upon them was to see perfection distorted into menace. It was during these years that a new series of incidents plagued the town. Crops failed inexplicably in fields near the Sullivan home, though neighboring farms flourished. A disease swept through livestock, killing cattle and pigs, yet leaving the Sullivan family's animals untouched. Children began to wake screaming in the night, claiming they had seen the three siblings standing outside their windows, though no footprints were ever found in the morning. The town's minister, Reverend Collins, declared openly from his pulpit that the triplets were cursed, that the devil had placed his mark upon them. Tension reached a breaking point after the death of Martha Green, an elderly woman who had long accused the triplets of witchcraft. One morning she was found lifeless in her cottage, her face twisted into an expression of sheer terror, though her body bore no wounds. Some said she had seen something that had killed her with fright. Others whispered that the triplets had finally silenced their accuser. Though no evidence tied them to her death, the townsfolk believed it without question. The whispers hardened into certainty the Sullivan children were responsible. Jacob and Margaret were torn apart by the growing hostility. Margaret begged Jacob to leave, to take the children and move far away where no one knew their names. But Jacob, worn down by years of defending the indefensible, refused. "Wherever we go," he muttered, "they will follow. We cannot escape what they are." His words chilled Margaret, for she realized he no longer thought of them as his children, but as something else entirely. Inside the farmhouse, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Margaret noticed that the triplets often disappeared for hours into the woods behind their home, returning at dusk with dirt under their nails and a strange look in their eyes. She once followed them, keeping her distance, and claimed she saw them standing in a circle deep in the clearing, hands joined, their lips moving in a chant too low for her to hear. The wind had whipped violently around them, though the trees above did not sway. Margaret fled in terror before they could see her. The distance between parents and children widened. Jacob, once stern and unyielding, began avoiding the triplets altogether, retreating to the barn to drink away his dread. Margaret tried desperately to reach them, to remind them of her love, but the children responded with silence, or worse, with smiles that seemed to mock her efforts. One evening, when she begged them to pray with her, one of the triplets whispered, "We do not pray to your God, Mother." The other two nodded, their faces calm, certain. Margaret collapsed into sobs, realizing she had lost them forever. By 17, the triplets held a terrifying sway over the town. Strangers began to travel from distant places just to glimpse them, having heard rumors of the cursed children of Dover. Some treated them as curiosities, while others approached with reverence, convinced they were touched not by evil but by some divine or supernatural force. The attention only fueled the fear of the locals, who now saw their small town becoming the center of a legend that threatened to consume them all. The breaking point came during the winter of 1856. A brutal storm had descended upon Ohio, burying farms beneath snow and leaving families desperate for food and firewood. In the midst of this struggle, several townsfolk claimed to see the triplets walking barefoot through the snow, unaffected by the cold. Their footprints left no mark in the ice. When news of this spread, the town could bear it no longer. Meetings were held in the church, voices raised not in whispers but in anger. "They must be cast out," Reverend Collins declared. "If we do nothing, we invite damnation upon us all." Inside the Sullivan farmhouse, Jacob and Margaret felt the shift in the air. One night, Jacob admitted to Margaret that he feared not only for the town, but for themselves. "They are not ours anymore," he confessed. "We brought them into this world. But what if they were never meant to be here?" His words echoed the fears Margaret had long buried. Together they sat in silence, listening to the laughter of the triplets drifting from upstairs, a laughter that no longer sounded like joy, but like something mocking, cruel, and otherworldly. The triplets, though still young, carried themselves with the weight of destiny. They spoke often of leaving, of going somewhere beyond. Margaret did not understand their meaning, but the certainty in their voices terrified her. When she begged them to stay, they simply told her, "You will not follow us. You cannot." Their words cut her deeper than any blade. By the close of their 17th year, the town was poised for confrontation. Fear had ripened into fury, and the people no longer intended to sit idly by. Jacob and Margaret knew it. The triplets knew it too, and perhaps in their strange unity they welcomed it. For though no one could say what they truly were, one thing had become clear. The Sullivan triplets were no longer just a family's burden. They were an enigma that demanded resolution, and the coming storm, whether by the hands of men or by forces far darker, would decide their fate. The winter of 1857 did not ease the tension surrounding the Sullivan family. The snow had barely begun to melt when whispers of action spread through Dover like wildfire. For years the townsfolk had tolerated, gossiped, and prayed for deliverance, but with each passing month, the triplets' presence grew heavier, more suffocating. Fear was no longer enough. They wanted resolution. It began with Reverend Collins, who stood before his congregation on a bitter Sunday morning, his voice booming with righteous fury. "We cannot let this continue," he thundered. "These children, no, these creatures, have brought nothing but misfortune to our community. The Lord tests us, but he does not ask us to suffer evil in silence. We must act before it is too late." His words were met with murmurs, then with nods, and finally with shouts of agreement. For the first time, the people of Dover were united in purpose. The Sullivans had to be confronted. Jacob caught wind of these whispers at the tavern, where he had taken to drowning his fear in awe. He overheard men planning late into the night, voices thick with anger and drink. They spoke of gathering torches, of marching to the Sullivan farmhouse, of purging the evil that had cursed their town. Jacob stumbled home, the cold wind biting at his face, his heart heavy with dread. When he told Margaret, she collapsed into sobs, clutching at his hands. "We have to take them away, Jacob. Tonight, before it's too late." But Jacob, weary and beaten, only shook his head. "Where would we go? They would find us, or worse. They wouldn't let us leave." The triplets themselves seemed unfazed. When Jacob warned them of the town's anger, they only smiled, their identical faces serene. "They cannot harm us," one said softly. The others nodded in perfect agreement. It is they who should be afraid. The calmness in their voices sent a chill down Jacob's spine. It was not defiance born of teenage arrogance, but certainty, like they already knew how events would unfold. The march came 3 nights later. A mob of nearly 30 men and women gathered outside the church, armed with lanterns, pitchforks, axes, and hunting rifles. Their faces were hardened, their voices filled with grim resolve. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they moved toward the Sullivan farm, their shadows flickering in the lantern light. Above them, the moon hung pale and full, casting the countryside in an eerie glow. Margaret heard them first, the distant rumble of voices carried on the wind. She rushed to the children's room, breath frantic. "They're coming," she whispered, tears streaking her face. "Please, we must leave now." But the triplets sat calmly at the edge of their bed, their hands clasped together. "No," one replied. "This is what we have been waiting for." When the mob reached the edge of the Sullivan property, they hesitated. The farmhouse loomed dark and silent, its windows unlit, its walls heavy with shadow. The air itself seemed thicker, colder, as though warning them back. But the Reverend raised his torch high and shouted, "We will not turn away! God is with us!" And with that, the crowd surged forward. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, his body swaying with both drink and fear. "Please?" he cried, his voice breaking. "These are my children! You must leave us be!" But the mob would not listen. "They are not children," someone shouted. "They are abominations!" Another voice rose. "Give them to us, Jacob, or burn with them." Before Jacob could answer, the triplets appeared at the doorway behind him. They did not flinch at the sight of the armed crowd. They stood together side by side, their identical faces illuminated by the torchlight. A murmur of unease rippled through the mob. Some lowered their weapons, unnerved by the calmness in the children's eyes. Then it began. The torches flickered violently, though there was no wind. The air grew heavy, pressing down on the crowd until it felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. One by one, the men and women faltered, their bravado weakening. Some swore they heard whispers, low, insistent voices curling at the edges of their minds, urging them to drop their weapons, to flee. Others felt a sudden wave of nausea, their stomachs twisting as if poisoned by fear itself. The Reverend, though trembling, pushed forward. "Do not be deceived," he shouted. "They are the devil's work." He raised his torch higher, stepping onto the porch. At that moment, the triplets turned their gaze on him, their eyes locking in unison. The Reverend froze mid-step. His torch slipped from his hand and landed in the snow, where it hissed and went out. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came. His body convulsed once, then crumpled lifeless at Jacob's feet. A scream tore through the crowd. Panic erupted. Some fled into the night, dropping their weapons in the snow. Others stood frozen, torn between fight and flight. The triplets did not move. They only watched, their expressions calm, almost amused, as the mob disintegrated before them. Jacob fell to his knees beside the Reverend's body, his hands shaking. "What have you done?" he whispered, though whether to the mob or to his children, he did not know. Margaret, clutching the doorway, sobbed uncontrollably, her cries piercing the night. The triplets stepped forward onto the porch, their movements graceful, deliberate. They looked out over the scattering crowd and spoke in unison, their voices low but carrying through the cold air. "You cannot fight what you do not understand." The words sent a fresh wave of terror through the villagers. Those who had not already fled turned and ran, leaving only the Reverend's corpse in the snow, the farmhouse looming silently behind them. When the last of the villagers had disappeared into the darkness, silence fell over the Sullivan farm. Only the sound of Margaret's sobs and the crackle of dying torches remained. The triplets turned back inside, as though nothing had happened. Jacob stayed on the porch, staring at the body of Reverend Collins, his mind numb. He understood now what Margaret had feared all along. There would be no escape. Their children, if they could still call them that, were no longer part of this world. The confrontation had ended, but it was not a victory. It was a revelation. The triplets had shown their power openly, and the town had seen it. Dover would never be the same, and deep within their farmhouse, the Sullivan family knew this was only the beginning. The death of Reverend Collins spread through Dover like a sickness. By dawn the next morning, every house in town knew the story. The Reverend had fallen at the feet of the Sullivan triplets without a touch, without a word, as though his life had simply been stolen from him. Some swore he had been cursed, others that God himself had struck him down for his arrogance. Whatever the truth, one fact united them all. No one who had stood in that mob would ever forget the sight of the three children standing in the torchlight, calm and unshaken, as the town's most powerful voice crumpled lifeless before them. But if the people were united in terror, they were divided in belief. For every voice that shouted of witchcraft and evil, another whispered of miracles. "They are chosen," some said, their eyes wide with awe. No human could hold such power unless they were touched by God. Others, their faces hardened with fear, swore the opposite. "They are devils." They spat, "And if we do not destroy them, they will destroy us." Within days, Dover split into two camps. One group gathered in the tavern, plotting quietly, their voices bitter with rage. They spoke of fire and guns, of ending what should have been ended long ago. The other group gathered in the church, now without a pastor, their prayers twisting into something new. They did not ask God for protection from the triplets. They prayed to understand them, to be near them, to receive their blessing. Jacob and Margaret Sullivan felt this division more keenly than anyone. Their home, once a place of whispers and suspicion, was now a magnet that pulled strangers from miles away. Some came bearing gifts, food, candles, coins, as offerings to the children. They stood outside the farmhouse at night, kneeling in the snow, waiting for the triplets to appear in the window. Others came armed, circling the property like wolves, watching for a moment of weakness. The Sullivan farm had become both shrine and battlefield, and Jacob and Margaret were trapped in the middle. The triplets themselves seemed untouched by the storm they had caused. They moved about the house with the same unearthly calm, their eyes always knowing, their voices always measured. Sometimes they stood at the windows, watching the strangers who knelt in the snow. Other times they disappeared into the woods for hours, returning with the smell of earth and smoke clinging to them. When Margaret asked what they did there, they only replied, "We are preparing." Preparing for what? She did not dare ask again. One evening, a woman named Esther Briggs arrived at the farmhouse, a widow known for her fierce piety. She carried with her a loaf of bread and a small silver cross. She begged to see the children. "I know they are special," she whispered to Margaret, her eyes shining. "I can feel it in my bones. Let me be near them just once." Against her better judgment, Margaret allowed it. The triplets received Esther in silence, standing together as always. She fell to her knees before them, tears streaming down her face. "You are God's messengers," she cried. "The Reverend was blind, but I see! I see!" The children only looked down at her, their expressions unreadable. Finally, one reached out and touched her forehead with the tip of his finger. Esther collapsed instantly, not dead, but trembling, her body racked with sobs of joy. When she rose, she declared to Margaret, "They have blessed me. I am chosen." She left the farmhouse that night, spreading her testimony across Dover. Others soon followed. Within weeks, a small group of worshippers had formed. They gathered outside the Sullivan home, chanting prayers of devotion, calling the triplets saints, angels, even gods. Their faith was fervent, unshakable, and it frightened Margaret almost as much as the children themselves. But not everyone bowed in reverence. The other faction grew more violent with each passing day. Samuel Green, nephew of Martha Green, who had died under mysterious circumstances, emerged as their leader. His hatred was raw, fueled by grief and rage. He rallied the angry men of Dover with fiery words. "If we allow them to live, we will all be damned. Do you not see what they are doing? They gather followers like a plague. If we wait any longer, it will be too late." Fights broke out in the streets. Neighbors who had once shared bread now hurled insults. Families who had prayed together now stood on opposite sides of the divide. Dover was no longer a town. It was a battleground of belief, and at the center of it all were three teenagers who spoke less and less, yet whose silence commanded more power than any sermon. Inside the farmhouse, Jacob's despair deepened. He no longer drank for courage, but for numbness, his hands trembling even in daylight. Margaret's health faltered, her eyes grew sunken, her hair streaked with gray. She prayed constantly, but her prayers were hollow, unanswered. Sometimes she caught Jacob staring at the children with a look she could not read. Was it fear or hate? The triplets, however, seemed to thrive. Their bodies grew taller, their features sharper, their movements even more precise. They spent hours each night in their upstairs room, candles flickering in a perfect circle around them. Margaret once tried to enter, but the door would not open. It was not locked, yet when she pushed against it, it held firm as though some invisible force pressed back. From inside came whispers, layered and rhythmic, a language she could not understand. She fled down the stairs, her heart hammering in her chest. The divide in Dover reached its peak when Esther Briggs, the first to call herself chosen, led a procession of worshippers to the Sullivan farm. They carried candles and sang hymns twisted into praises of the triplets. They laid flowers at the doorstep, chanting for the children to reveal themselves. From the woods, Samuel Green and his men watched, rifles in hand. Hatred burned in their eyes, but fear kept them from attacking. They too were waiting for the right moment. That night, Margaret pleaded with Jacob to take her away. "We cannot live like this," she sobbed. "We will die here one way or another." But Jacob only stared into the darkness outside, where shadows of kneeling figures flickered in the candlelight. "It's too late," he whispered. "They don't belong to us anymore. They never did." The triplets stood silently in their upstairs window, gazing out at the crowd below. Their eyes glowed faintly in the candlelight, their faces calm, unreadable. In that moment, it became clear the town was no longer deciding what to do with the triplets. The triplets were deciding what to do with the town. The winter of 1856 had been harsh, but nothing in Dover chilled the townspeople more than the invisible war raging within their borders. For weeks, the Sullivan farmhouse had become the epicenter of chaos. Its worshippers flocked to its doors with offerings and hymns, while others circled with rifles, waiting for a chance to strike. The air itself seemed thick with dread, as though the land knew something unspeakable was about to happen. The tension finally snapped one moonless night in February. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling every step, and the Sullivan farm stood silent except for the faint flicker of candlelight glowing through the windows. Outside, two groups assembled. On one side, Esther Briggs led nearly 30 worshippers, their hands clasped around candles, their lips moving in low, fervent prayers. They spoke not to God but to the triplets, whom they now called the Children of Dawn. On the other side, Samuel Green and his men stood armed with muskets, their eyes hard and unblinking, determined to end what they saw as a spreading infection. Jacob Sullivan stood on the porch, his face pale, a bottle dangling from his trembling hand. He looked neither at the worshippers nor the armed men. His eyes darted to the upstairs window, where he knew the children were watching. He felt them before he saw them. The weight of their gaze pressed down like iron. Margaret clutched his arm, her voice trembling. "Jacob, please, let's stop this. Let's send them away, anything. Just end it." But Jacob only shook his head. "It's too late," he whispered. "They've already decided." Esther Briggs stepped forward, her eyes wild with devotion. "Children of Dawn," she cried, raising her arms to the farmhouse. "Bless us with your presence! Show these men your power so they may repent!" Her voice carried across the snow like a hymn. Samuel Green spat into the snow. "Power," he barked. "I'll show you power." He raised his musket, aiming it toward the window. The crowd gasped. Fingers twitched on triggers. The fragile balance between faith and fear shattered in an instant. Before Samuel could fire, the farmhouse door creaked open. Out stepped the triplets. They moved in unison, barefoot in the snow, their thin nightclothes fluttering in the wind. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes glimmering with an otherworldly light. The worshippers fell to their knees at once, some weeping, others chanting, "Children of Dawn! Children of Dawn!" Esther Briggs sobbed uncontrollably, clutching the snow like it was holy ground. The armed men wavered. Their courage faltered as the children walked closer, their movements smooth and deliberate. Samuel Green gritted his teeth, trying to steady his aim. "Don't be fooled," he shouted. "They're demons." He pulled the trigger. The musket fired, the shot echoing like thunder through the valley. But the bullet never reached its mark. Midair it slowed, twisting unnaturally, before dropping harmlessly into the snow. The triplets never flinched. They only continued walking, their gazes locked on Samuel. Panic rippled through the armed men. One by one they fired, the night exploding with smoke and sound. Yet every bullet bent fell, or vanished, as though the air itself rejected them. The worshippers screamed, not in fear, but in triumph. "Miracle! A miracle!" Samuel's rage boiled into desperation. He drew a knife, charging forward with a roar, but he never reached them. Halfway across the field, he stopped, his body convulsing as though unseen hands gripped him tight. His musket clattered to the ground. His knife fell from numb fingers. Then, with a sickening crack, his body twisted backward, bones breaking in unnatural angles until he collapsed in a heap on the snow. The field fell silent except for the ragged breaths of the onlookers. The triplets stood over Samuel's broken body, their faces cold, unreadable. Esther Briggs let out a sob of ecstasy. "They have judged him!" she cried. "They are righteous! They are divine!" But to the armed men it was no miracle. Terror consumed them. Some fled into the woods, their rifles abandoned. Others fell to their knees, not in worship but in pleading, begging for mercy. The triplets said nothing. They only turned their gaze upon the worshippers, who knelt in rapture, believing themselves blessed. Jacob Sullivan staggered down from the porch, his face pale, his eyes wet with tears. "Please," he whispered to his children, "please, stop this. They don't understand. They're just frightened." His voice cracked, his body shaking with the weight of his despair. For the first time, one of the triplets spoke aloud, his voice cold and echoing, as if more than one tongue spoke through him. "They are not frightened, Father. They are ours." Margaret let out a strangled cry, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Jacob fell to his knees in the snow, broken, sobbing. He knew then what he had refused to accept for years. These were not his children. They had never been his. The triplets turned back to the crowd, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. With a single glance, the kneeling worshippers fell silent, their chants dying on their lips. They stared up at the children with blank devotion, as though their will had been erased. The triplets raised their hands slowly, and the worshippers bowed their heads in unison, moving as one body, one mind. The armed men who remained scrambled away into the night, their screams lost to the wind. Dover had been conquered without a single battle, without a single word of negotiation. The town was no longer divided. It was claimed. As the triplets led their worshippers toward the farmhouse, Margaret turned to Jacob, her eyes wide with terror. "What are they going to do?" she whispered. Jacob's voice broke as he answered, "Whatever they want." The farmhouse door shut behind them, leaving the snowfield littered with footprints, blood, and the lifeless body of Samuel Green. Overhead, the night sky was starless, the darkness complete. Dover would never be the same again. The morning after Samuel Green's body lay twisted in the snow, Dover woke to a silence so heavy it felt unnatural. No birds sang, no dogs barked. No children played in the street. Only the sound of boots crunching in the frozen dirt echoed, as neighbors walked past one another with their eyes lowered, their mouths tight. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone knew who now held the town in their grip. The Sullivans' farmhouse, once an isolated patch of land on the edge of Dover, had become a sanctuary and a fortress. Worshippers filled the yard, kneeling in the snow despite the bitter cold, whispering prayers not to God but to the triplets. They built crude altars of wood and stone, draped with ribbons and candles. Some carved strange symbols into the trees surrounding the farm, shapes that no one recognized, but that seemed to shimmer in the torchlight. Inside the farmhouse, Jacob sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bottle in his hands. His face was gray, his eyes sunken, his spirit broken. Margaret moved about the room like a ghost, her voice a hollow whisper as she muttered half-finished prayers. But the children, no, the beings that looked like children, were calm. They sat upstairs in their circle of candles, their faces serene, their hands linked, as though nothing in the world could disturb them. On the third night after Samuel's death, the triplets descended the stairs together. Their movements were silent, their steps perfectly in rhythm. The crowd outside hushed instantly, dozens of heads turning toward the farmhouse door. Esther Briggs was the first to speak, her voice trembling with reverence. "Children of dawn," she whispered, "what would you have of us?" The triplets stepped out onto the porch, the pale moonlight casting their faces into sharp relief. One of them, no one could ever tell which was oldest, for they were too alike, raised his hand, and the crowd bowed as one. Then, for the first time, all three spoke together, their voices layered into something both beautiful and horrifying, like a choir echoing from the depths of a cave. "You are ours," they said. "Your lives, your bodies, your children, your future. Dover belongs to us." The word sent a shiver through the crowd, but no one resisted. Some wept with joy. Others simply bowed lower, their faces pressed into the snow. A few of the worshippers, caught between devotion and fear, tried to turn away, but their feet would not move. It was as if invisible chains held them rooted in place. Margaret clutched Jacob's arm, her voice trembling. "Do you hear them? They're taking everything. We have to stop them." Jacob shook his head, tears streaking down his face. "Stop them? Margaret, don't you see? We never could. They're not children. They never were. We were fools to think they were ours." Over the following days, Dover transformed. The church was abandoned, its wooden cross torn down and replaced by the symbols carved in the forest. Families brought their children to the triplets, laying them at their feet for blessing. Those who resisted found their doors marked with strange signs, and within days they disappeared, swallowed by the woods, their homes left empty and silent. The triplets rarely spoke, but when they did, their commands were obeyed without question. They called for feasts, and townsfolk slaughtered their livestock in offerings. They called for silence, and the entire town fell into eerie stillness, not a voice daring to rise above a whisper. They called for devotion, and Esther Briggs organized rituals that twisted familiar hymns into praises for the children. Margaret grew weaker, her prayers hollow. She barely ate, barely slept, her eyes haunted by the sight of her own offspring leading the town into darkness. One night, she whispered to Jacob, "I can't live like this. I'd rather die than see them consume everything." Jacob only stared at her, his face empty. His bottle slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, and he muttered, "Then perhaps death is mercy." It was on a night of thick fog that the final act unfolded. The triplets summoned the townspeople to the field beyond the Sullivan farm. Hundreds gathered, their torches glowing faintly in the mist, their breaths clouding the air. Jacob and Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, their faces pale, their hearts pounding. The triplets stood upon a mound of earth, their figures illuminated by the torches. They raised their hands and silence fell like a weight. Then they began to chant, their voices weaving together in a language no one understood. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The fog thickened, curling like fingers around the crowd. Some worshippers fell to their knees in ecstasy. Others clutched their children tightly, their faces caught between awe and terror. The armed men who had once opposed the triplets were nowhere to be seen. Those who remained had either fled or bent the knee. Dover belonged wholly to the children now. As the chanting grew louder, the earth split open at the triplets' feet, a deep crack glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The crowd gasped, some screaming, others singing. The air filled with the smell of sulfur and smoke. From the fissure rose a sound not of this world, a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the bones. Margaret clutched Jacob's arm, sobbing. "They're opening something." "Jacob, they're bringing something through!" Jacob could only stare, his lips moving soundlessly. His faith, his fatherhood, his sanity, All had been shattered. The triplets' voices rose to a crescendo, and the light from the fissure flared, casting the crowd in stark black and white. In that moment, everyone saw not children but beings far older, their eyes endless, their faces masks of something ancient and alien. The illusion of humanity slipped away, and what stood before Dover was no longer flesh and blood but something eternal, something that had merely borrowed the form of children. The fissure widened. The crowd screamed. Some ran, but the fog swallowed them whole. Others collapsed, their minds broken by the sight. Esther Briggs raised her hands in rapture, tears streaming down her face, crying, "They are the dawn! They are eternity!" Her voice was drowned by the roar rising from the earth. Jacob fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. Margaret screamed, her voice tearing into the night, but the triplets did not look at her. They only gazed into the light, their faces calm, serene, as though they had finally come home. And then, with a sound like thunder tearing the sky apart, the fissure closed. The light vanished. The fog lifted. The field was empty. The triplets were gone. In their place remained silence and the broken town of Dover. Homes stood, people breathed, but nothing would ever be the same. Some whispered that the children had ascended, others that they had gone below. Some believed they would return, others prayed they would not. But all knew the truth. Dover had been touched by something beyond comprehension, and the scars would never heal. Jacob Sullivan was found days later, hanging from the rafters of the farmhouse, his eyes open, his lips twisted in a final, silent scream. Margaret disappeared, her body never recovered. The town withered in the years that followed, its name forgotten on most maps, its history erased by silence. But in the deepest corners of the forest, the strange symbols remained carved into the trees, their lines unweathered by time, their meaning unknown. And when the fog rose thick on cold winter nights, some swore they could hear the faint sound of children's laughter, carried on the wind, reminders that the triplets had never truly left.